All right, well, let's look at our questions tonight. We've got a few questions that have come in already this year. Probably about 6 questions that have come in. And Van hasn't even gotten started yet, so we know that there will be some more. But we've got some good questions that have come in, and I would encourage any of you that have some to give them to me in person, or if you want to drop them in the basket on Sunday morning, or email them, or post them on Facebook for us. Any way you can get them to me is fine, and we'll take those questions. But tonight we have 2 questions from the beginning chapters of Isaiah, which fits in well with the Christmas series that we just did, which was Isaiah's Child of Promise, and we talked about chapters 7, 9, and 11, and the prophecies of Jesus' birth that occur in those early chapters of Isaiah. And the questions from tonight come from Isaiah chapter 4 and chapter 6, so even a little bit earlier than that. So I invite you to open up to Isaiah chapter 4, and we're going to look at the prophecy there about the branch of the Lord. The branch of the Lord in Isaiah chapter 4. And then we'll be looking at Isaiah chapter 6 as well for the second question. So Isaiah chapter 4 is actually a really short chapter. If you've ever looked at that before. I noticed that when I was studying for the Christmas series, only 6 verses there in Isaiah chapter 4 before they move on to chapter 5. And the first verse actually, it kind of goes better with chapter 3. A little bit of an odd chapter division there. So if your Bible has headings like mine does, it says the branch of the Lord at the beginning of verse 2. And that's the section where our question tonight comes from. It says Isaiah 4 is a prophecy that sounds more like the Exodus than a future event. What does it mean? So what is the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 4 about? Well, let's read that first, and then we'll talk about it. Somebody like to volunteer to read Isaiah 4, 2 through 6 for us?
I got it.
All right, thanks, Artie.
In that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of the survivors in Israel. Those who are left in Zion, who remain in Jerusalem, will be called holy, all who are recorded among the living in Jerusalem. The Lord will wash away the filth of the women of Zion. He will cleanse the bloodstains from Jerusalem by a spirit of judgment and a spirit of fire. Then the Lord will create over all of Mount Zion and over those who assemble there a cloud of smoke by day and a glow of flaming fire by night. Over all the glory will be a canopy. There will be a shelter and a shade from the heat of the day, and a refuge and a hiding place from the storm of rain.
Okay, yeah, good, thanks, Artie. So this is one of the promises that gives hope in the early chapters of Isaiah. If I was going to break down the early parts of the book for you, I put a chart together here that I thought would really help us out a lot, because you see 4 major sections of promise or prophecy or hope that are occurring in the early chapters of Isaiah. First of all, you have chapter 1, which is mostly judgment. In fact, the vast majority of the early chapters of Isaiah are about God's judgment. So most of chapter 1 is about judgment. There is about 4 or 5 verses that are mixed in through there that are promises of hope. But most of chapter 1 is judgment. Then you get to the beginning of chapter 2, and there's the promise of the mountain of the Lord. And we're going to look at that in a minute just so you're familiar with it. Then we go to another long section of judgment, which is the rest of chapter 2 and chapter 3 up until the very beginning of chapter 4, verse 1. After that section of judgment, then we go to our passage that we're talking about tonight, the branch of the Lord, which is verses 2 through 5. Then we go back again toward judgment, verses chapter 5 through chapter 8. And that's when we arrive, after that section of judgment, the first prophecy that we talked about in December, about the promise of a child that would be born. Unto us a son is born, to us a child is born, a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This is a huge messianic prophecy. This is a huge prophecy about Jesus, and probably the fullest explanation of him in the beginning chapters of Isaiah. Now, chapter 7, we also had the promise of the virgin birth. We talked some about that, but that's actually coming in within a judgment section. That's not actually a specific promise in the context of the hope that God is bringing to the nation of Israel at that point. So you have the chapter 9 section, then you have another judgment section right after chapter 7 begins, and then you have chapter 11, which is the branch from Jesse, which we also talked about a couple Sundays ago, where it talks about a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. All right, so that gives you the layout of the early chapters of Isaiah. I wanted you to see that. Now, one that we haven't looked at yet is the mountain of the Lord. So let's look at this first passage of hope here. Isaiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Keep in mind, this is after a prophecy of God's judgment. If we end up chapter 1, we'll see, but rebels and sinners will both be broken. Those who forsake the Lord will perish. You will be ashamed because of the sacred oaks in which you have delighted. You will be disgraced because of gardens you have chosen. You will be like an oak with fading leaves, like a garden without water. The mighty man will become tinder, and his work a spark. Both will burn together, with no one to quench the fire. So this is pretty deep darkness and gloom type stuff like we talked about in Isaiah. But after that, here's what chapter 2 says. This is what Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. You remember in chapter 11 how it talked about the nations would rally to the banner of the branch, the branch of Jesse that was coming up. The nations would gather. It says, many people will say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we will walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Now, there are a lot of similarities there with chapter 9 and chapter 11 about what we're going to see during the end times. And there's also some other things, because it talks about how the mountain that the temple is built on will be a mountain to the Lord that will be glorious, and it almost pictures the mountain growing out of the ground, being even taller than it actually was. The temple that Solomon built there being the center of all the worship of God, that God's glory was going to dwell there in the temple, that his law was going to go out to the nations. This is very much a picture of the ideal of Old Testament worship, where when they had the temple, when they were looking forward to God's rule there in Jerusalem, when his king was established, a king was sitting on David's throne, and all of this was coming to fruition. So this is in many ways an idealized promise of an idealized fulfillment of what the Old Testament hope was, that the temple would be exalted, that the king in the line of David would sit on the throne, that Israel would rule all of the nations, that all the other nations would be subservient to Israel, and they would flock to Israel for the wisdom of God and for the law of God, and that God would basically rule the earth through the nation of Israel. That's a picture of what Isaiah is talking about here. You see that it will be exalted above the hills, and the nations will stream to it. That's the Temple Mountain. Many people will come to say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord. He will teach us his ways that we may walk in his paths. Also the promises of peace, that the child of promise would be the Prince of Peace from chapter 9, right? Mm-hmm. Here we see the nations beating their swords into plowshares because they don't need swords anymore. They'd rather use that metal for farming, right? And their spears, their weapons, into pruning hooks. So they're not having to go out and fight wars anymore. They're turning their spears into things they can harvest food with, because there's peace on earth, that God is ruling righteously and with justice, and all of the promises that you're seeing later on in Isaiah having to do with the Messiah, we're seeing them here in chapter 2, but it's not centered around the Messiah necessarily. This is about the mountain of the Lord. And if we were to ask today, what is the fulfillment of this? After our end time study, this should be a question that's relatively easy for us to answer. the answer is that this is a picture of the New Jerusalem and the city that is a temple. That is going to be the mountain of the Lord, metaphorically speaking, that all the nations will stream to. And the law of the Lord, not meaning the Old Testament law, Mosaic law, but the law of the Lord, meaning the word of God is going forth and the nations are obeying it. They're rallying to this new glorious New Jerusalem. Okay, so that's what, reading from a New Testament perspective and looking back on the promise of Isaiah chapter 2, that's what we would say that we're looking forward to. So when we look at that, the mountain of the Lord is there. Then we have some more sections of judgment. The end of chapter 2. For an example, chapter 2, verse 11, the eyes of the arrogant will be humbled and human pride brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. I mean, he's going to judge people and he's going to be shown to be the Holy One. In all of this, Israel is not repenting. They're not turning back to God. They're remaining in their sin. God tells them that there's going to be judgment. This is the section that talks about the women of Zion flirting with their eyes, strutting along with swaying hips, their ornaments jingling on their ankles. The Lord will bring sores on the heads of the women of Zion. The Lord will make their scalps bald. This is the judgment that's happening between chapter 2 and chapter 4. All right? So the judgment on the women is the specific context of the end of chapter 3. Instead of well-dressed hair, baldness. Instead of fine clothing, sackcloth. Instead of beauty, branding. In that day, 7 women will take hold of one man and say, we will eat our own food and provide our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. So another bleak picture of what's going to happen because of God's judgment to the nation of Israel now. But Isaiah doesn't leave them in despair. He says there is still hope for a faithful remnant of Israel that is going to survive. And here's what is going to happen, he says. In that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. And the fruit of the land, this is the land that's just been decimated, and all the crops have stopped growing because of God's judgment, and people are in despair. There's no food to eat. What did look like that, now it says, the fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of survivors in Israel. Those who are left in Zion will remain in Jerusalem. They will be called holy, all who are recorded among the living in Jerusalem. The Lord will wash away the filth of the women of Zion. One of the commentaries today said that word filth meant vomit. So I just took his word for that. I didn't do any further research on that, but just to give you the kind of disgusting picture of what's going on there. The Lord will wash away the filth and the disgust, and he will cleanse the bloodstains from Jerusalem. Bloodstains possibly being from the war and the battles that have taken place. And he will wash away the bloodstains from Jerusalem by a spirit of judgment and a spirit of fire. Then the Lord will create over all Mount Zion and over all those who assemble here a cloud of smoke by day and a glow of flaming fire by night. So Jerusalem and the city of God were a disaster because of the unfaithfulness of Israel, but God says there is going to be a small, faithful group that I am going to preserve through that, and they are going to be the branch of the Lord. This branch is going to be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be pride and glory of the survivors of Israel. So let's look at the different aspects of this prophecy, okay, in chapter 4, verses 2 through 5. First of all, we see the branch of the Lord. So what is the branch of the Lord? Now, the NIV makes an editorial decision to capitalize the word branch here, which that leads you to think it's what?
Jesus.
That it would refer to Jesus. And that is one possible interpretation, that the branch refers to Jesus. However,
or it could be the branch that where we are entwined with him. We're the branches.
Right. Well, the branch could be the people,
yeah.
The faithful people that is basically the remnant. That's what we've got up here. Either the remnant or Jesus. Now, scholars debate which one it is. Let me tell you the arguments. Number one, the argument for Jesus is that when the term branch is used, elsewhere in Isaiah, for example, you have the branch of Jesse. That clearly does refer to Jesus. And there are other times in the prophets when the word branch is used. And one claim that I saw even today said every other time the word branch is used, it refers to Jesus. So that's kind of the argument that branch should be capitalized here and it refers to Jesus. However, as you read the context of this verse, I was more persuaded by the other viewpoint that says this is actually referring to the remnant of Israel at this point. That it's not a specific messianic prophecy, but it is a prophecy about God redeeming his people. So I think the better understanding is that the branch of the Lord is the remnant of faithful people who are remaining in the city of Jerusalem, that God is going to... Here, the prophetic vision is of almost everybody being wiped out of Jerusalem, the city being almost desolate and empty, and then God preserving the few people that are left, blessing them, coming in and cleaning up the city, and then the city becomes once again a glorious place where people are following his word and his commands, and he's dwelling with his people again. That's the prophetic vision of this. And I think that makes more sense than seeing this as a specific prophecy about Jesus. But as we get to the end of it, I want to tell you that I still think it points us to Jesus, just not in that specific direct way. Okay? So we've got the branch of the Lord first. We also have the fruit of the land. What is the fruit of the land? I think that refers to that's actually defined in verse 2. The fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of the survivors in Israel. So those that survive after the judgment is passed, there will be joy that we made it through. We were faithful to God, and we are still living in the city. And as God blesses, there will be pride and glory there. We also have those left in Zion, which is representing the remnant. They will all be holy, it says, because the picture of a remnant is one of the commentaries today said it's like if you buy a piece of fabric from the fabric store. You buy it in a big roll, and then you make a garment out of it. You cut it up. You cut it according to the pattern that you need, and then you make the garment, and then there's leftover fabric. If you have enough, then maybe you can save it to use for something else. But for the most part, all these scraps you're just throwing away. That's the picture of what a remnant is. The remnant is the leftover, seemingly discarded portion, seemingly worthless, which is what the remnant seemed like, the faithful remnant seemed like when Israel was worshiping idols and all these evil kings were there. They promoted all kinds of evil and people that were not interested in following God. So all the people that remained faithful to God, they were marginalized, they were ostracized, they were cut, they were discarded as really not all that important. But this remnant, though they are small, they will all be holy. And that points to the faithfulness of this remnant that's there. And not only that, but as God works, he's going to continue to make them holy and refine them, is what we see in this vision.
So when you talk about the remnant, you're talking about, one of my notes says Judah, vice remnant.
Yeah.
So are we talking about the southern kingdom? Basically?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Isaiah's prophecy is written to the southern kingdom. So this is, I'm saying Israel in the broader sense, but this is particularly to the kingdom of Judah.
Right.
Israel is going to be judged during the time that Isaiah is writing. The northern kingdom, if you're looking at them as two separate kingdoms. All right? So we have the filth and contamination that we talked about. That represents the sin that's washed away by the Lord. Now here's where our question tonight specifically comes from. God says that there's going to be a cloud of yeah, there you go. Smoke and fire, which sounds very familiar because we spent a lot of time in Exodus a little while back, right? And if you look there at verse 5, it says, "Then the Lord will create over all of Mount Zion, those who assemble there, a cloud of smoke by day and a glow of flaming fire by night. Over everything, the glory will be a canopy." And when you hear that, that brings your mind back to the Exodus, because when God led the Israelites out of Egypt, he went with them as a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. He was protecting them in that. He was guiding them. He was showing them where to go. He was standing between the Pharaoh's army. He was protecting them like that. Most of all, this pillar of cloud and fire represented what?
Protection.
It represented protection, yes, and glory. But most of all, as Israel looked up and saw that pillar of cloud and fire, what would they be reminded of?
God is in control, that He is the,
Not just that He's in control, but He's here with us.
oh,
God was-
His presence.
Yeah.
yeah.
The pillar of cloud and fire this is God. He's going with us. He's going in front of us and behind us. He's protecting us. This is God Himself. We are in His presence. He's being visibly manifested. So when it says that there's a cloud of smoke and fire here, that's using Old Testament imagery, saying that the presence of God is here in a visible, glorious way. And there's also a pillar of cloud and fire when God's presence enters the temple as it's dedicated during Solomon's day. So once again, this represents God's presence and how strongly He is with His people here in this holy city. All right, and then it says at the very end of it, it will be a shelter and shade from the heat of the day and a refuge and hiding place from the storm and rain. What does that remind you of?
Jonah.
Jonah, okay, because he was under the leafy plant, right?
Oh, I was thinking.
But his leafy
of
plant
Elijah.
died, so he didn't really have that, did he?
Elijah.
God provided it.
Elijah,
Yeah.
Under the plant, you know, when he was fleeing.
Yeah.
Right,
he-
yeah.
But
Shelter and shade and refuge and hiding place from the storm and rain. I think that pushes us all the way back to Revelation 21 and 22.
Go to the caves and all. People will.
No, I'm thinking about heaven.
oh,
It's a picture of heaven. Peace on the mountain of the Lord is the way I said it. Drawing back from chapter 2, where there's refuge and there's shade and there's peace. There's no longer any, like we go back to chapter 2 and look forward to chapters 9 and 11. There's no threat of war anymore. God's peace, His presence is there and His peace is reigning.
It reminded me of Psalm 91.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, there are a lot of different ways that this is fulfilled, and all of the promises that are pointing us forward, at least in some small way, to the future day of rest and glory in God's presence, in the new heavens and the new earth. All of these are pointing in the same direction. So there are a lot of different ways that are going to be reminded, but I think this is the ultimate destination that it's pointing us to. And here's where this prophecy is fulfilled, because if you look at it and you say, well, here's the remnant and God's presence is going to dwell in Zion again, and there's going to be a pillar of cloud and fire, and God's presence is going to be there. If you look at later Old Testament history, when the remnant was restored, if you want to look at that as the captives brought back from Babylon and the rebuilt temple in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, there's weeping when they dedicate that temple because the glory isn't there. There were some small fulfillments of the way that God was going to regather His people back in the Old Testament, and even in other times in human history. But this prophecy is ultimately a promise of God's full glorious presence and rest for His people, which is going to be fulfilled in the new heavens and the new earth, stated in terms of past events in the Old Testament, specifically the Exodus, leaning on the Exodus account with the pillar of cloud and smoke and fire, which this is completely what we expect when we come to prophecy, right? It's given in terms that the people of that current day would understand, and it's pointing to a future reality, sometimes a future reality that's bigger and more expansive than they would have been able to speak about or explain in their day. So, I don't think this is a specific prophecy about Jesus. I don't think it's a messianic prophecy like chapter 9 is and like chapter 11 is, and chapter 7 with the virgin birth prophecy. But I do think that all of this is pointing toward the day that God redeems His faithful people. And this is a promise from Isaiah that God would do that and He would accomplish that. And He's using that great Old Testament imagery to accomplish that. All right, let me see if you guys have any questions about that section. Isaiah chapter 4. The really cool prophecies there in chapter 2, 4, 9, and 11. I hope you've enjoyed covering those as we've talked about them. Let's look at our next question.